This is another Black History Conversations. It's good to have folks here with us today because we're going to be hearing from Montaz Marche. She's going to tell us about her research on Black women in the 18th century in Britain. I'm Liz Millman from Learning Links International, and I also welcome my colleague Simon Fringo from Belong Nottingham, who helps with the technicalities behind all of this and other advice. Thank you very much, Simon, as always. Montaz is also going to be talking about her interesting work with UCL and the National Archives on project, which at the moment I think has a title, This is Black Britain. But we'll find out more about that. Then we're going to explore how our work in Black History Conversations may fit in with Montaz's ideas. And then we're going to catch up with the Windrush Allies Network because we've got June Elizabeth Whitesmith Gully and Gavik Praegog with us, also from Justice for Windrush Generation. So that'll keep us busy for the next hour and a half, I should think, or however long. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, Australia, where I am. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions, and the culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across the nation. And we're making good progress with our new government here towards the First Nations people having a voice to Parliament, and we're going to have a referendum. So interesting things going on here in Australia to challenge the racism that's existed since Captain Cook stepped on shore. Right, okay. Just to say that last week, I don't expect you to read all of this, but we were joined by Joseph from Nigeria and his students. And he wasn't able to speak to us, but he could hear what was going on. So he said his equipment was malfunctioning. Now, his final year history students are really interested to join in and see what we're doing. But the reason that I had the contact with Joseph was that he wrote an extremely good report about the West African West African history book, which is now available online. Yes, it was really good to hear from him. And he's really an enthusiast for teaching history in Nigeria. And we learned from Professor Sati, who also joins us from time to time from Nigeria, how important it is that an interest in history in Nigeria is generated, because for quite a long time it was off the curriculum. So yes, it was disappointing that Joseph couldn't speak with us, but I just wanted to recognise that. I also want to thank Martin Pinder for keeping up to date on Chief Thomas's travels. So Chief Thomas is doing a really interesting project, which I'll read a little bit more about in a moment, but he's been around and about visiting organisations across the UK because he's looking at the story of Corporal Mbondo Jacques and other Congolese students who died in the First World War. So he's off to Belgium, he's probably in Belgium now, looking to discover the graves of 100 Congolese soldiers who died during First World War, and they're buried at Kindcot Cemetery in Belgium. So it'll be interesting. I'm sure Chief Thomas will come back and tell us more about this. So we went off to Charing Cross Hospital and he went to the National Archives, and that was it. Kwaku and I have been in correspondence recently, and he's got an event going on today at 6:30 till 9 via Zoom. Now, I'm not quite sure if you want to, I can put the link for the WhatsApp. I can put that onto the chat if anybody's interested. Sounds good. Learning experiences continue. Comedic, musical, educational, and political videos. So Kwaku's joined us on a number of occasions recently, and we've been communicating about finding out more about Enrico Sennett's film. This is an interesting book and an interesting series that people might not have heard about, the Anthem series in citizenship and national identities. And this is a book that's come out recently, Legal Identity, Race and Belonging in the Dominican Republic. So this will be something to look out for folks in the future if they want. And this is just a little bit more about Anthem Press. So it's interesting to know all the different, or at least some of the different organisations around the world that are supporting the exploration into Black history. Also, the Springer Nature sprung into my eye line as well. So they're doing quite a lot of interesting things, publishing trusted report research. It's good also, there's a lot of research is now becoming freely available. It isn't being locked up in ivory towers. So that's really good. So that you can really get some good stuff from people who are now can communicate so easily all around the world. Right, this is another thing for this evening, 7:30 till 8 in the UK. Black Heroes Foundation celebration of Black heroes. Feed Your Soul, celebrate Windrush 75 with song, dance, stories, news, and labrish. Come on, Garrick, say labrish to me. What does it mean?
Labrish. I don't use that word, Liz, at all.
Well, isn't it interesting?
It means talking. It means talking, gossiping.
Yeah,
chatting.
yeah.
Labba.
I was a bit concerned
Gossip,
because
Sir Cliff said it means gossip.
Yes, yeah, that's what it is. It's gossip. Yeah, and chronics in chronic song it says, you know, leave people business alone, right? The idea of you know, chatting too much and talking what you're not supposed to talk and interfering in people thing. But yeah, all that connotation of you know, mind your own business.
well, I was a bit concerned because I wasn't sure if it was a polite term or not, because sometimes words referring to the way that descendants of enslaved Africans on the different Caribbean islands and in different parts of the world, the way they speak is often referred to negatively. So I looked it up and discovered that there's a site called Wordnik, and they describe it clearly here, and they use it in a sentence. I'll just start from part way through. The cricket commentary is almost better on radio. The pleasure of labrish, the quintessentially version of gossip, Jamaican version of gossip, which is not about scandal, but about pleasure of telling and enjoying a tale. And the Rastafarian tradition of reasoning in which people at all levels of life discuss politics, social, religious and philosophical issues, largely for the sake of doing so. So just so interesting. And then I discovered that if anybody's got $25 to spare, I assume this is American dollars, then you can adopt a word. So somebody could adopt labrish and have it on the site. Maybe we'll get Natalie Fagan Brown to do that. She's a great linguist. Okay, so this is something else going on today. It's all going on today, this evening. It's the Pan-African, I can't read the rest of it, group, Pan-African group, as Standing in Freedom, honouring the strength of our African sovereignty. And the next one gives the rest of the details. It's a free session, but you have to register through Eventbrite. The Zoom meeting, look forward to seeing you. So that's another thing that came up. Also, were any of you able to attend this Zoom live?
Yeah, online? I was. It was fantastic.
Excellent.
Wonderful it was.
Yeah. And it says not who you think they are. So who are they then?
Going to was like, you know, the way that we are projected, in the sense, like when it was open for discussion, they were waiting for somebody to say something and nobody never said anything. So they started it up, and Arthur Carrington Arthur Torrington. So I said, I think it should be the British government's Windrush scandal, right? Rather than the Windrush scandal, because later on in history, people will look at that wondering what scandal did the Windrush people create? Okay. And then Arthur Torrington, he came back and he said, well, he thinks it should be called the Home Office scandal. Take the Windrush out of it. So they said what they tend to do, they tend to put, when there's something negative, they try and put our name next to it. So it kind of deflects away from them. So that's what it was all about, really.
All right, thank you very much indeed. That's really helpful.
It's a good point, Liz. It's a good point that Sister June Elizabeth just mentioned, because across Global African Congress, the Pan-African movement, we tend to focus on the hostile environment rather than focusing on the Windrush scandal. That bring, you know, other issues in to the conversation. So, you know, there are people who don't like to use that terminology of Windrush scandal. The hostile environment been going on long before the Windrush scandal broke in 2018. So, you know, we tend to focus on the hostile environment as a bigger issue.
All right, that's good. Thanks very much.
Can I add to that, that in fact the hostile environment goes back way before even the Windrush arrived. I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago whose English mother married a European, and she lost her British nationality. And when eventually she kept applying for return of her British citizenship, and she was not granted it because she'd lost her status, and so she was treated as an alien who had a right to come to England, back to England. So the hostile environment
really
been around for a long time. Yeah.
But specifically targeted against people who'd come into Britain normally, but that's an exceptional case, isn't it?
Well, apparently that was normal. If you were English, if you're an English woman and married a European, you lost, or anyone else in the world, you lost your British citizenship automatically.
Gosh, amazing. All right, so the next slide says, and now PhD student Montaz Marche will tell us about her research on Black women in the 18th century, and then we'll hear about your other activities you're doing. I have to say, Montaz, when I did a little bit of Google researching, I could have been up all night reading things that you'd written. So excellent, thanks a lot then. So Montaz, over to you. Will you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. I didn't know that. I don't know, like, I don't really know how Google stuff appears, to be honest. I just say, oh, there's someone knows stuff about me. I'm like, oh, that's a surprise. I am Montaz. I am a PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham, and I work at UCL on a public history project around Black British history too, which is This is Black Britain. But first I'm sort of going to speak about my PhD research, which looks at Black women in 18th century London. Now, the motivation for that was essentially, it came from two places. It was firstly that I was always interested in history, and I had this very much two sides of this history. It was one that I got in university, in like schools and stuff, where I could engage with the 18th century and really love this part of history, but it was very much sort of the Black history was relegated to either a story of slavery or nothing. And it was very much sort of, there wasn't a inclusive history or diverse history in that respect. And then there's the other side of this history, which was the history that I got from my family and from my grandparents and people that I knew in the community who told me about Black people in this period and told me so many different things. And there were two sides that I very much couldn't align together. And in that way, I was sort of very dissociated because it felt like I was living two history lives. And so with this project that began as a side project that became my MA thesis and then became my PhD project was sort of a way for me to sort of rationalize this both of these worlds and sort of create this inclusive history that was absent. And with the 18th century in particular, it was always sort of rationalized as this period of tumultuous change, you know, the Enlightenment with industrialization, print culture, and the development of civility and ideas like that. But there was a considerable absence of representation of Black women. And also the fact that Black women were very much immersed in these cultures of change. And it kind of felt, I suppose, to me, because I was interested, to sort of start asking this question: what was it like to be a Black woman in 18th century London? And so what my research thus far has done is I've compiled a database looking at various archives, particularly like parish records, newspapers, hospital records, anything sort of that I can really gauge a reference to Black women in. And I've amassed a database of over 500 women in the London area. So that's London, like the City of London, Westminster, Southwark, Middlesex, and sort of the East London that was developing in this period. And it is by no means the full population. I don't think many obviously are not recorded in the archives, but also I'm only one person, so I can only go through so many archives. But it is very sort of representative. It's an important sample to sort of speak about not only the demographics of this population, who were this population, but also to consider more broadly, what were their Black women's experiences? How did they navigate race and gender and class within the local environment, and think about the ordinary Black woman rather than just sort of the individual elite women like Dido Elizabeth Bell, who, you know, obviously has this portrait and we kind of know, I mean, are getting to know more about. But there was a whole population of Black women who were living in London, who were immersed in communities and developing networks. And so I sort of started to try to engage with that. But there's obviously challenges with this history. I mean, in the archives, it's challenging enough with so many violences committed, and with the absences of Black histories and the references to Black women and Black people generally, but also Black women particularly, were very brief, sporadic, and they were often written by third persons. So they were not written by Black women themselves. And many historians, scholars have sort of stated that this has left Black women dispossessed in the archives, and that means we couldn't necessarily get at their stories. But my methodology sort of engages with this idea that within every reference to Black women, there is despite the fact that it was written by a third person author, it holds evidence of a Black woman's action or a personal circumstance, and when analysed together or as a population, can be used to discern a composite image of Black women's lives, gauging their circumstances, their context of their experiences, particularly when layered against the social histories of London. And now this field is considerably wealthy, right? There's a lot of details on London as this world city, as a centre of governance and culture. And sort of having that background of London social histories, we can able to sort of gauge and rationalize women's histories, Black women's histories, and London's histories to create this sort of composite image of what Black women's lives were like. I'm not sure if I'm able to share my screen. Is that a possibility?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Fine. You can do that, Simon. Can you sort that out?
Yep, you should be able to share.
Amazing. I'm just gonna hopefully share a PowerPoint. There we go.
It's just amazing. 500 women so far. Gosh.
So I'm not sure if let's actually make that a full size. So this map that I have here, I don't know, is that showing properly? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you.
Great. So this map here, what I decided to do for this research was to actually map women as much as I could. Now, obviously, there's a lot of references of women that don't contain any information about their locations, but for a large proportion, what I could isolate were areas of presence, so where we could sort of generally pinpoint where they live. So if they were in a parish, for example, they would have been probably in a particular area at a particular point. And there are other women who we could isolate actual residents. So this map here that you're looking at highlights the women who I could pinpoint actual locations for, like addresses or streets or places where they lived. And that makes up about 20% of the database. But as you can sort of see, it highlights how, despite being a small population, as often been described in historiography, Black women were dispersed across London's communities in various spaces across the century. And so we can see, and as this is only the portion that were recorded, it's highly likely that there were more Black women within these spaces. And what I've sort of determined thus far is that there were, it was possible for Black women to kind of exist under lots of different class brackets. We have women who are working women, women who were middle-class women, and women who were sort of the upper echelons or access to, and women who sort of bridged all of those lines. But then also Black women operated in different spaces. So they were servants, they were mothers, they were wives, they had social networks, they aligned with a lot of the cultures of womanhood in terms of what women could do in the space, because obviously like lives for Black women in this period were significantly limited, but they were married, they had children, they worked along with other women in the area, but also beyond that, they were like protesters, they operated in a lot of different spaces, basically is what I'm trying to say. And sort of looking at the demographics of it, this is sort of a quick lowdown of sort of the different things I was able to isolate. And so we have women who are working in loads of different industries. And in terms of migrancy, despite actually, which is interesting, that only 20% of the database that I was finding thus far actually refer to women who were recorded as migrants. And so we have migrants from America, from Africa, from Asia, from the West Indies, and from Europe. And so we have we can reimagine London as this space of Black women who immersed from a global space into London, and thus with that brought cross-cultural ideas and cross-cultural engagements or daily interactions with ideas of race, with ideas of empire. And with that also we brought, naturally, there were colonial practices brought in with them. So we have a lot of evidence of Black women who were either in exploitative or informal relationships with white gentlemen, white planters, white military men particularly as well. And so we have those evidences of that kind of diverse population. But then we also have this perception of Black women as evolving within the space, and it allows us to sort of reimagine London as this diverse space that engages with ideas of gender and engages with ideas of race according to generationally across time. And that idea was changing, particularly in terms of like the way Black women were referenced, who was referenced. You have ideas of like women who were sort of middle class who weren't even referred to as Black. And that also is another question that has emerged within this research is, yes, we identify these women as Black because they were referred to in sources as Black, but how did they self-identify? How did they engage with their own perception of race and identity and difference within the context of the society? And it's sort of, that's what my research is sort of trying to get at, is highlighting these tensions between how women were referred to and how they actually thought of themselves, and how that would work on different levels and different areas of record. I just want to see if I can, are you still seeing the page? I'm just making sure.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can see on, yeah.
I'm just going to stop sharing for 1 second because I just want to get back up my notes. But yeah, and it's kind of recognizing that, and I also emphasize in my research that local geography was really important, because as we saw, like with London, there's obviously every community is different, every space is different, they each has different cultures and different class brackets and different engagements. And I recognize that had an influence on Black women's lives. And so in seeing that, we can engage with the different experiences that Black women had, the different forms of acculturation, different forms of engagement that Black women would likely have, and the different networks they would have had, and the diversity of their experiences across spaces. So yeah, I mean, that's sort of a rough introduction to my research, and I imagine there's probably more questions than, but I think it's trying to kind of bring it all down to something quite short and sweet, just to introduce it anyway. But there's some fascinating women that I've come across in this research, and I think for me it was so gratifying to sort of see these different narratives and be able to recover some of these narratives, and kind of complement the history of Black people in the 18th century. You know, obviously alongside your Ignacia Sanchos and your Lada Pianos, we have these women as well, and hopefully be able to promote their presence post PhD. So that's sort of a short introduction to it, but hopefully that makes sense and is intriguing anyway. But yeah, so that's
certainly is intriguing. Gosh, that's fantastic. I'm afraid that was yes, a round of applause. Gosh, you summarised that so well. That's marvellous. That was just Makapi Selassie who phoned up. He's based in Tanzania at the moment, and he's having problems getting through today. So such are the difficulties, but Zoom. Well, Montaz, that was fantastic. So questions for Montaz about this work she's doing and comments?
Yes, can I ask you, I know you did the 18th century, you're doing the 18th century, but I don't think there's been much shift in the way that people identified themselves like a few years over, just going into the 19th century, when Mary Seacole, as you spoke about, you know, the relationships between Black women and women of colour and white gentlemen. Well, Mary Seacole's mum was mixed race. So therefore Mary didn't really see herself in Jamaica as a Black woman, right? And she put it in her autobiography. But when she came to England, she realised she was not she couldn't step into the white arena. Yes. So is there any kind of similarity?
Oh, for sure.
Research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the thing as well that we need to sort of recognize, is that just because Black women were racialized in the source material as Black does not mean that's like how they saw themselves, and it's a much more complicated conversation about race. I think so. You see a lot, particularly for Black migrant women who are coming from the Caribbean, particularly if they were, for example, the daughter of a planter, or there was some sort of higher rank, I suppose. You do get women classing themselves more as either of dark complexion or of color, or not even referring to their race in itself. And that's not something they felt that they needed to do, because it wasn't. And also the ideas of race in this period are a little bit different, in that class played an important role in identification as well as race. And so if someone was of a higher class, being referred to as Black may not have been, like, it wasn't likely to be the case. And even people who were say Irish, or who were of working class social class, or who were I suppose even in any sort of way referred to as different and not close to the European elite ideology, could have been referred to as Black. And so it does become a lot more complex. And also Black in itself was a hyponym that referred to like people of Asian heritage, people from all around the world, right? Native American heritage. So it does become really complex to try and like highlight who was of African heritage specifically. But it is recognizing that just because we identify them as Black women doesn't necessarily mean that is what they would have referred to themselves. And it's a much more subtle history there that we need to kind of identify, that, you know, race is complex in every period, but particularly here when these ideas are sort of just forming in the 18th century. But yeah, I think Mary Seacole is a very good example of how that relates. So I'm definitely gonna snipe that. Thank you for that reference.
Good one, June. Then okay, Sean's got something to contribute.
Well, of course, there are two kind of other related problems, particularly say with parish records, because the people who filled in the registers didn't always put any comment. So there may be many Black women who are in the registers, but we don't know because they weren't identified by the clerk as Black. And secondly, for instance, I know of a couple who married, and they were referred to as, I can't remember the exact, I think they were referred to as Black. But when you trace down to when they had children, that word was not used. So for instance, if somebody is 17th century but has children who live in the 18th century, unless you track back those, you can track back from the children in the 18th century, the parents in the 17th century, where they might have been called Black. You wouldn't necessarily know the women in the 18th century were Black. So, I mean, there are still lots of unresolved problems. Have you, I noticed on your map, you've got one person in Putney and one in Lambeth. Can you recall their names?
No, but I can get up my database and find them for you. But yeah, so there's definitely a few, and also because the map itself, because the maps weren't as developed, and like I'm using my reference for London, as in like the London that I know quite well, but obviously London in that period would have been very, very different.
Yes.
And what would have been demarcated as London.
Yeah. With the Lambeth one person, have you consulted Steve Martin?
No, I have not. Well, not specifically on that case. No, not on that case. The person in Putney was called Sarah Russell.
Have you got any more details?
Yes. So, actually, no. Yeah. So Sarah Russell, and she was married to Thomas Russell, and they had a daughter called Mary, and that was in 1714 in the parish of St. Mary in Putney, in June time.
Right. I'll check my info and see if I flagged her up in the past. Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, this cross-referencing will be really helpful.
Yeah.
If you've got one place where the stuff is, then if somebody finds something, just before you say, Garrett, I'm really interested in a lady, she's not in London, a lady called Tabitha the Black. We think she's a lady. And she donated funds for use in the parish of Beaumaris in North Wales. Audrey Duty's done some research on it as well. So it's, you know, all these little bits can all come in together. Oh, this is lovely. Welcome, McCarthy, while you're here. And we've also got Caroline Sansom joining us. So a big welcome to Caroline when she arrives. Garrick, you've got your hand up.
Okay. Can I just ask a couple of questions? So this project is very much focused in London. So there's nothing outside London. So, you know, all the other cities, the industrial cities and so forth, there's nothing there that, you know, that probably will be a separate piece of work. But this is London focused. And it's true, you've made a point about class, and in many respects, the class is probably a much better way of finding people, because you've mentioned the fact that you know, when people marry, obviously they take on the name of their husband and that old family thing, and that moved them into a different class system, which means that they separate themselves from, you know, from others. And that has been the case throughout history, and it's the case now, even in 2023. there are people from the Black community who have done that. You know, they literally separate themselves and they think, oh, I can leave Lambeth and I can go and live in the country somewhere, and you know, and so forth. So that still goes on. But I'm just thinking about the children of these women in terms of their identity and in terms of their education, because if they marry into a family similar to the slave owners who would identify those illegitimate children and then move them away from the plantation and, you know, get them educated elsewhere in the UK, etc. And there's a disconnect from their culture and everything else, you know, because they have to live almost a different life in order to survive. Are you able to pick up any of those issues?
Absolutely. I think children are really interesting dynamic. I think that's kind of what I've learned from this research, is that obviously because women had families, and then the way children are recorded in these records compared to adults is very distinct. And I think even there's like an absence of racialization in relation to children when you compare it to how adults are racialized. And I think that highlights how children are perceived a little bit. But I think that it definitely depended on class, and there's definitely an evidence of children kind of receiving more education and receiving an education that was on par with an English child's education of that class, right? And that is very important, because I think it's about aligning with the cultures of the community and the class bracket that you were in within that space, and emulating the ideas of elite education, of culture, of civility, of politeness, and having the kind of background education to present oneself as a person of, I don't know, middling or upper class. And so you do have evidence of children who have sort of made the move to Britain. So there was an example, a woman called Charlotte, whose father was said to be a gentleman, but I mean, there's no sort of evidence to sort of back that up. But she did have, I found her in a school record. And so in sort of, there was that conscious movement of educating children in order to elevate status. And I think that was an important sort of narrative and I think sort of people like Daniel Livesey, who did a book on mixed race Jamaican heiresses heirs and heiresses in Jamaica, sort of highlight that the emphasis of education, and particularly when children are, I suppose, in the circumstance of an enslaved and exploitative relationship, are sort of claimed by parents to rise them up through education. And but I think that there's definitely a wide range of children in the database as far as I've seen. And so obviously with a lot of younger children, there's not as much children of working class, there's not as much evidence of education in a formal sense, in like tutoring and local charity schools or parish schools. But we do have evidence of them becoming apprentices or becoming or entering into labor, which was expected of them, right? Because they needed that to survive. And so you see different forms of education within within these young girls' education anyway. And so we can sort of imagine that there would have been a practical education, a less formal education that would have come from parents and social networks and people around them and employers and masters and stuff like that, that would have arisen. So I suppose, yeah, there's lots of layers to it, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic and so interesting. And yes, Garrick, I can see PhDs all around the country, and this is why we need the regional stuff, don't we?
Yeah.
You know,
yeah.
The universities are taking responsibility to ensure that the history departments are encouraging the research into local Black history, Just to give you an example, Bangor University, I think they've just started in North Wales, they've just started a Black History course, but considering they've got Penrhyn Castle with all its plantation links and history absolutely on the doorstep, and the university isn't necessarily beneficiaries because it's a more modern university in some ways, I think. But yeah, it's really interesting. So that's just brilliant. So if it's okay, and there are more questions, maybe folks can come forward with those afterwards, Montaz. But I just wanted to explain, Montaz, so you understand what it is we were looking at trying to do. So I've got a PowerPoint, and I'm just going to quickly, as we change over, then you can tell us whatever you think is appropriate to talk about at the moment with regard to your work that you're doing with UCL and the National Archive. Is that all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so we called or we're saying Black British History, county by county, exploring the threads of Black history in our local history stories, and we're including links with the wider British Empire, including Asian studies. So I've included a map there because it's good to think about when we're talking about Black British history. I think we need to include the south of Ireland as well, because at the times that we're talking about, Ireland wasn't divided up. So it's probably appropriate to do that. And that's an area that we've under-researched, Ireland. It's been difficult. Garrick's got some links he's going to put forward. So we've been exploring threads, it says here, with folks from all around the world. But there's the two things, and there's where the British went and that Black history, but also the Black histories in the area. So it's really since the murder of George Floyd that we started this off in that October following that. But what I'm interested in is how some local communities have explored their local Black history. And this quote from Bewdley Anti-Racism Group, I think, is interesting because they have done some really in-depth research into the Black history of Bewdley. Now, I happen to know Bewdley well. It's in Worcestershire, and it is the most unlikely place that I could ever have thought that would have an anti-racism group that was researching Black history. It just looks like a typical lovely little English town on the River Severn. But we know the River Severn was a trade highway at that time, and they've really looked at the trade that went between Shrewsbury and Bristol and so it's embedded in every nook and cranny, and that really made me think. And they've not been able to join us yet on Black History Conversations, but I live in hope. And they also got Bewdley Council, Town Council, to pass a motion amendment or whatever about this and to state how important it is. So it's really supported right through their community, which is really interesting. So I'm really looking forward to going to meet them when I get back to the UK. So I think we've explained that. And then it's also interesting to understand why so many British people chose to go and live in other people's countries to find better lives. A really interesting reflection on, we can understand why the Irish went to live in other people's countries, but you would have thought that ordinary British people would think it was a jolly good place to live in, but lots of them decided that there were other places. The Welsh people, for example, who went to Patagonia and set up a whole life there so they could live as they chose in somebody else's country. Very interesting. So and then I think the elephants in the room, the disguised truth of the horrors of the British drive to steal people, to steal lands, to steal wealth from so many nations around the world. The scale of British imperialism can be hard to define, hard to acknowledge. And as a nation, just a little nation living on small islands off the coast, why did we feel we had the right to do what we did for centuries? So I think it's about a good bit of reflection. we see the damage done, I say, using Ukraine as the awful example that we're seeing now, by invasion and destruction. Well, Britain and the other European nations were the invaders, and in centuries before times, when these same European nations dragged peoples from other nations around the world into the two world wars. And it's interesting that we referred to Chief Thomas's work researching the Congolese soldiers who were killed in and buried in Belgium in the First World War. So to recognise the true history of Britain, I feel is essential, starting with an honest exploration of local history is the one way this may be achieved. County by county, we started off saying this was country by country because we are looking at different countries around the world, okay, but this part is county by county, city by city, community by community, because it's not often enough Black history to be explored in one small community. Doesn't have to be a whole county, but if you're trying to engage schools in feeling confident to talk about Black history, talking about local Black history is really a good way because their children can do research into the Black history of their town. For example, the children in Colwyn Bay can do research into the African Institute that was there in North Wales. The Congolese students and students from all over the world came to Colwyn Bay. What a great history project. So that's what we're looking at, and how I've looked at trying to help people to think about what Black history might be going on in their area is that I've got a 1A4, okay, this is a big version so you can read it and I can read it. So we've included in the threads early and ongoing Black presence. We've been through this a few times, keep adding things to it, so it's going on to 2 pages now. Links to plantation and slave ownership by local families and landowners, and of course the use of the Legacies of British Slavery website is just really good there, where there are links with the coastal communities and others, with pirates and slave ship captains. Again, my interest is particularly in North Wales, and there's a great story about Gifford. Remember his other name, I'm sorry, Gifford Piers, who was a pirate who captured, he was
Gifford Pennant.
Gifford Pennant. No,
Yes.
it wasn't Gifford Pennant, it was
Oh.
Gifford. Thank you, Caroline, you're coming in. It was
Yep.
Piers Griffith. I'm getting it wrong.
Oh,
Piers
Piers
Griffith,
Griffith. Yeah.
pirate. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. This is Caroline Sansom who's joined us. Caroline's a part of the Learning Links International team, and it's great McCarthy's with us as well now. So greetings, McCarthy from Tanzania, Caroline from North Wales. Thinking about Piers Griffith bringing a Spanish galleon into the harbour by Bangor, and then the goods on board having to be transported down to Carnarvon in order for the value of the goods to be decided, so that the Crown could have a certain percentage, and and Piers Griffith and his crew could have the rest. What a brilliant story! Nobody knows about it around and about it, as far as I can find out. Also, slave ship captains. Apparently, Welsh slave ship captains were in favour because they were good at managing their crews and they used song a lot. Now, isn't that an interesting point? It's the famous Welsh singing. 4 was we put commodities produced for the slave trade, including luxury goods from the empire that were brought into bonded warehouses and then went out to other parts of the world. And some of the commodities, less likely ones we discovered, was the production of Welsh plains, a cloth, woolen cloth produced specifically for export through Liverpool. But also gunpowder. We had specialists speak about that. Terribly important. Guns and cannons don't work without gunpowder. And that was about production in northwest England. in a very rural area, you have to produce gunpowder in places away from significant communities. Receipt of commodities, okay, if you think of all the Bristol trade and the London trade, the business of London, and I'm really interested, Montaz, that you're focusing on London, because London can almost be too much of a challenge at times. And I have to say, I've stayed cleared, particularly looking at London's role in the slave trade. But coming from Wales, we've got plenty to be thinking about with Liverpool and Bristol, so perhaps neglected London. So it's good you're here with us. And then the local people with roles in the colonies and plantations. And the example I give here is the Littleton family. I couldn't, who come from Hagley in Worcestershire. Worcestershire is where I was brought up. I couldn't understand why in Kingston, one of the main roads is called Hagley Park Road. Hagley Park Road. Hagley Park is about 3 miles, if that, away from where I was brought up. And Lord Littleton was as a governor in Jamaica. And those stories are never included in local history of our area. We knew nothing about that. So fascinating there. We've also missionaries, interest. We've explored some stories, for example, about the Reverend William Hughes in North Wales. And then the armed services. Now you've got your Gifford Pennant, Caroline. Gifford Pennant, who was master of the horse in Cromwell's invading force that went over to invade, I think it was Hispaniola, and they weren't successful. So then they looked at Jamaica as an easier option. And then Gifford Pennant eventually ended up staying in Jamaica. He was a supporter of Cromwell, so probably wouldn't have been a good idea to come back to Britain. But then he and his descendants managed to create enormous wealth from the plantations and the enslaved Africans who they purchased. We're following those stories up very closely at the moment with the Pennants Project. Then there are the links with World War I and World War II service, which we've talked about again. And I know in Northeast England, there's been so much work done on this, and it's just excellent. I'm just wondering if we got on this list, we've got sports people. I don't think I've added that on yet. So that's another history to look at. Then the important contribution of the Windrush generation, including people coming to the UK from across the Commonwealth countries. Not just, as we've spoken before, not just people coming from the Caribbean, but so many people came into Britain to rebuild the mother country after the Second World War. Never mind about all the people who came in at early stage. And I'm not sure, Montaz, if we've included your cohort in this. I suspect we haven't. There's so many different aspects of Black history. Other Black history links, for example, stolen goods on display in local museums and stately homes. And if I haven't told you this story before, we've had a great TV series here called Stuff the British Stole. That's the name of the show. It's been fascinating, going into in-depth exploration into stuff the British stole, and showing where it's and it is an Australian series. It's not a BBC program. I don't think it is. Fascinating. So it's interesting how local museums are looking at the artifacts that they've got and need to check their cellars as well of all the things they've got there. Then if the names of towns or villages or countries are used in other parts of the world, and find out why this is. A colleague of mine over here called Ian is doing research into all the Welsh place names there are around the world. I tell you, this is huge research, and it must be taken on board by, we think, probably the archives in Aberystwyth, the Welsh Archives, National Archives. Yes, because seeing Hagley Park Road in the middle of Kingston is a bit surprising, but you know perfectly well why. And as I say, there's another street name I mentioned and pub names. Okay, so this is the list that we got up to so far. What were we going to do if we then encourage people to explore their local Black history, or somebody like Sean, you know, you've done all the exploration, you know it all. How are we going to, you know, make this information accessible for future generations so that they can do more research and understand even more about the Black histories of our communities across the UK. So I'm going to go over to you now, Montaz, and ask for some comments and hear about where you're coming from. And as I say, the National Archives was the common sort of link.
I mean, yeah. So I think like you touch on so many important points, that there's so many different aspects to this history, that in not just in terms of like materiality and the individuals in different spaces. And I suppose consolidating it together is kind of key, right, in order to not only just kind of promote the histories, but also make them accessible and make them digestible as well. And also I think sort of we were mentioning earlier this challenge of maintenance and like keeping projects like at the top of the Google search list. And so I suppose it sort of relates to what kind of we were sort of formulating on in UCL. Basically, my research was initially going to be an urban mapping project where I was going to publish all of my research and pin all of the women that I found and kind of produce that for public audiences to sort of engage with my research, because I didn't want it to be another thing locked behind a paywall. But sort of where this developed was that we were using this software in UCL that they've developed called Memory Mapper Toolkit, which creates historical or mapping projects. And so we're sort of thinking to do basically what you're thinking about is finding these histories and making a single hub to promote these histories and also promote the researchers who made them. I think that's another key thing, is that a lot of research that people have worked hard on gets absorbed by bigger corporations and institutions, and the various individuals who've worked incredibly hard in making these histories sort of get pushed to the wayside, and we get our symbol Black historians on TV or whoever that like to focus on that they become the staple Black British historian or Black historian, when there's like hundreds and thousands of people who've been doing this history and doing it for many years. So that's sort of what we're kind of working on, is consolidating all of this together, and that's what this is and will be, this sort of hub to promote every kind of researcher and every kind of research of individuals and organizations. And so I think that in many ways that sort of your project and ours align, because it examines that regional histories, examines intricately the different spaces that that Black history is present, has been a part of local communities. And I suppose it lends itself quite well to each other, in that there's so many networks that I suppose we're both sort of a part of that draw these things together. And I think it just sort of, the key stage is to find all of the biggest challenge, I suppose, is finding all of the research that has been done and is being done currently, and sort of pooling that, right? Because I think it's not just who's working now. There are so many projects that have been done beforehand that have sort of been lost, like you were mentioning. And it's now, how do we get at all of those things? And I think that's sort of working all of our various networks, right? And like consolidating that all together. So I don't know, I think that's a very exciting prospect, and it's exciting that we're all thinking along the same lines, which means it needs to be done, right? Because if we're more than one person's having the same thought, that means it's important. So yeah, I think that's kind of where we're sort of nicely positioned.
I think that's lovely. And just before you come in, Garrick, just to say that I've spoken before to you about this, I think, but the importance of community researchers. Now, Sean, I'm not quite sure how you would categorize yourself, as I can't remember, as a professional academic researcher or as a community researcher. I'm certainly a community researcher, and I have found some challenges, because academic researchers are academic researchers and they do things their way. Community researchers are community researchers and we do things our way. But I think it's really important to respect and recognize the two groups. It's really, you know, it just makes sense. But your approach is so opening and refreshing. I'm just absolutely delighted, and I'm really glad I contacted the National Archives, because I thought, what will they think, you know, some woman in Australia is contacting them about this. But it's brilliant, and it's so good that Kevin had the common sense to put us both in touch. Right, okay then, Garrick, over to you.
While you were going through that list, draft list, Liz, I've been thinking about, you know, a couple of things. Clearly, identifying the research, bringing these things to life is important, because that's exactly what Montaz is doing, and other people. The stuff that's been lost, hidden, or removed from history, we're trying to bring them to life. And that's quite a hard job to do. And often the academic researchers not really interested in that bit, you know, but the community researchers would be interested in that bit. And even going down to what you've said in terms of small little villages rather than big city and town. And you gave an example of where you didn't thought, you know, there would be any research done, but there it is. It's you know, there's a group there doing things. And so I'm thinking about what Montaz just said about trying to pull this together, trying to connect with what's been done in other places, probably bring it into a sort of central space that everybody can tap into it and access it and use it. But also the stuff we've done so far, Liz, in terms of Black history conversation, and I will keep repeating this, Black history conversation is British history conversation. It is European history conversation. It is African history conversation. It's bigger than just that local thing, because we know if you go across imperialism and colonialism, we know, you know, even starting with the British, that they've been all over the world. So, you know, we need to at least, you know, go wider than the Black history. Because I've always found when I have conversation with school children, whether they're secondary school or further education, you know, they've never had that sort of connection that there's a contribution of Black people's history woven into their own British history, etc. Yeah, and it's important to keep reminding people that is the case. When I market Black history, I don't market in the way of come to a Black history workshop. I market in the way of British history, and I connect all the other bits so that people get a much bigger view. And in thinking about that point, I'm thinking that the teachers union, and I don't know, we haven't had anyone from any of the teachers union on our platform, because these are the sorts of conversation that we need to try and influence at the curriculum level. We know that a lot of teachers are not trained, so that's why they literally are frightened to you know, to have these conversations. But you know, what can we do to change this? So can we then influence these teachers' union and these bodies of the work we're doing and how they might be able to tap in to this rich resource that is available, you know, and use that in their teaching? Because I think we're, you know, if we don't do that, we're missing a trick in terms of how are we, you know, educating the wider community and also the next generation of people.
Excellent, Garrick. Thanks very much indeed. You've reminded me, because we do need to have somebody come and talk to us from the Teachers Union, and the person I identified is the head of one of the teacher unions. I can't remember which one. It's not the NUT, but I'm a bit out of date with the different things over there, because he's a black guy. I thought that would be really good to ask him to come and talk about, you know, how is he promoting this? How is the National Association of Head Teachers dealing with this? I can remember when I used to go to national, the meetings of the National Association of Head Teachers and think, you know, how can we get the Black history bit into conferences of head teachers? You know, it's all important. So that's really good, Garrick. We'll talk some more on that, and that's a good point. Sean, you were going to come in.
Well, to be honest, there's no point. We're nearly at the closing time, so
No,
I've got
we're
much
just
more
going
to
to be
say.
a few more minutes because I've found the wonderful Bewdley page. So Sean, do you want to say something? Simon, are you going to join the
Yeah,
conversation?
I mean, this issue about schools has been with us ever since they brought the national curriculum in. And I was one of the few people to be arguing when that came in, when everyone was throwing their hands up in despair about how they won't be able to do anything on Black history or women's history or working class history, was that the local history element that you could bring in allowed you to add in anything you wanted into the subjects you were teaching. And it's about persuading every single teacher in the country, history teacher, that they can do this. And then they say, oh, we're busy, we're overloaded, there's all this bureaucratic nonsense we have to put up with. We don't have the time. So they want resources. And so there's a group, for instance, in the Northeast, of secondary school teachers who have a project underway, which I'm advising on, to create school resources based on the research that has been done in the Northeast, particularly targeted at secondary school courses. They're going to be talking at the History Association conference that's coming up. We have to remember that unless the National Education Unit can get its branches in each school to take this issue up, at the end of the day, it's down to the head and the governors to decide how to integrate these things. It doesn't matter what the government says, whatever policy changes, whatever changes they make to the national curriculum, it's down to what happens in every school. And those decisions are made by the heads with or without discussion with the governors. And getting into many schools is almost impossible because they do not respond to requests from outside. In terms of making all this kind of information that is being produced and put up on the internet, you know, this has been a problem for a long time. There's no way we're ever going to find one mechanism that links everything together. It would be too costly to do, and lots of people will start setting up their own websites, won't know about the overall one. So it'll just be what the purpose of the internet is. You know, myriads of information that people put up, and you have to do your research on Google or whatever search machine you use, and you have to keep doing it about every 6 months because so much more material is going up. Then, of course, we can't rely on the fact that information will remain on the internet. There have been examples. Sheffield University, for example, closed down its website on its former Centre for the Study of Freemasonry, losing a massive amount of resources, including details on the campaign among the Freemasons to allow former slaves to be admitted as Freemasons, because the previous rule had been you had to be born free. And universities will always justify this, you know, they haven't got the money, they can't keep it updated. Well, frankly, a lot of it doesn't need to be updated. We just need to know what has been done and what is in the arena. And networking doesn't work. So, for instance, normally Arthur Torrington will let me know about a Windrush Foundation event, but he forgot to do so for the one that was on the other day that Joan joined in on the Zoom. These things don't work because we're all human beings with our foibles and our difficulties. And there is no magic solution. We just keep doing what we can and helping other people who want advice and information. And through, I mean, Joan gets it. I do a blog, and I put in that blog all the information I receive on what's going on in Black history. But I don't know everything. Nobody does, because so many initiatives that are being created.
Shared your blog with us. Are you able to do that? Share the blog so we can link in with that. That would be great.
Yeah, but I'll need your emails. So if you email me at, in lowercase, Sean, SEAN,
yeah,
.Creighton, CREIGHTON,
yeah,
1947,
yeah,
at btinternet.com.
Thank you so much for that. Well, that's good. And I do agree with you that we'll never get everything onto one site. But when you look at some of the big sites, and UCL's site, classic site, it's just got so much information on it. And the National Archives have a responsibility to somehow be able to direct people to information, to other sources. And with, say, a university website, then there should be a facility maybe for, if it's going to be closed down, that it could be archived. As you say, it doesn't need to be updated, just need to be able to access it. Anyway, there's lots more things that we could discuss, wonderful things. Montaz, I didn't know if you wanted to come back in. And then I am going to share the fabulous Bewdley research, because it not only is local history research, but it's also a Black History walk. They made it accessible to people through a Black History walk. So Montaz, do you want to come in on any of those points that have been made?
I mean, I think I completely agree. I think that first there needs to be considerable investment. I think projects like this need to have a mind for creating resources. And that's something that I'm definitely passionate about, is not just creating a website, but just creating something that can be used within educational environments, so that it's functional, right? It's something that can be not just sort of stagnant sitting and some people interact with whenever it's needed, but it's something that can be actively used to facilitate learning processes. But then I also think that it is such a challenge to try and bring everything together. But I think it's sort of trying to do as much as you can, like you said, Sean, sort of as much as you can, and facilitating as many relationships as possible. And I suppose, yeah, just platforming as much as possible. And so that's sort of my aim with this, is to try and bring as much together as possible for as long as possible, and utilize the sort of networks and resources that I have to try and to make accessible, to undo the challenges of my own research history, where I was to particularly struggle to try and, like, I think we all do, to try and find this information before, you know, the age of Googles and like researching all this stuff. And so I just trying to counter as many challenges as I possibly can for however long I can. So I think I'm just sort of joining the fight in that way. And
fantastic.
yeah.
Your skill and capability, really focusing on this, and also your interest in maps, which I think is fascinating, because there's so much history in maps, isn't there? So thanks ever so much, Montaz. I'm just going to show you now Bewdley's Black History. All right, so this is on the web as PDF or whatever you call it. So they've done the research, they've made it, this is the anti-racism group, they've done the research and they've made it into a walk. Now I'm just going to quickly talk through the map so that you understand. This is the Great River Severn, which was transporting goods. It doesn't so much anymore now, transporting goods from Shrewsbury down to Bristol, going through the little towns of Bewdley, Stourport on Severn, etc., down the coast. So there's this beautiful bridge, and then there's lovely buildings up the high street here, really, really old buildings, very old church, and you know, other things. So interestingly, they've made this into a walk. So I'll go and do the walk. I'll take Marcia with me as well. She's from the Black History Walks Network group. And then they then explain carefully the history of Bewdley, demonstrating historical connections between the town and slavery, while also celebrating the town's history of radicalism. And they talk about the two issues. And then they give some detail for each place. So it's a self-guided tour. But you can imagine the local school children coming here and having an opportunity. What a brilliant way, because it's quite a small, well, never mind about quite, it is a very small town. So you can very easily walk around these places. There's no distance. So this is a little bit like the Black History Walk that our colleague David Alston up in Scotland, that he did in his area. He did it like this as well. So it's really interesting to see examples of how people can begin to share the stories of the Black history in local areas, making it very much more accessible to all sorts of people, all sorts of age groups. So, you know, from children studying in school through to retired people who are on holiday and may want to look at some different aspects to the story. And I suppose this is a really interesting one, Ticknall Manor. I'm going to tell you, Sean, you're 2 years older than me. Well, when I was a little girl, like a long time ago, I was taken to Ticknall Manor, and the thing that I really remember going, it was a private home there, is that they had a sugar loaf, and they had sugar loaf cutters and all the things that went with sugar. And in the area, there's a road called Sugarloaf Lane. So looking at just that name and then linking it back to the history is just fascinating. So yeah, so I'm particularly inspired by Bewdley, and I was glad to find that and be able to share with you. So hopefully that was of interest. Okay, right, any comments before we switch off the recording and formally thank you all? Makapi, it's really great that you've been able to join us from Tanzania. I know you're listening in, and that's really good. So maybe we'll have a little chat after we finish recording. Okay, then. So Montaz, thank you so much. I'm just really, really delighted you were able to join us, and we've covered some really interesting subject material today. Sean, I'm really grateful and pleased that you felt able to join us, and it's great, as Montaz was saying, it's really important that the researchers who've ferreted out all this history are recognised. And I know there's great work's gone on up in the northeast And I'm a bit of a newbie when it comes to researching Black history, so I have to learn about people who've done great work before. And all respect to you, Sean. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Garrick and June Elizabeth, thank you very much indeed. I don't know if you've got any updates about the Windrush activities at the moment that you want to do.
If I can just mention something, Liz, quite quickly. I'm going off in a minute to a location outdoor in New Brighton to have my photograph taken. That's why I've just changed my shirt for NHS magazine. However, June Elizabeth, this is also for your benefit. Patrick Vernon has been chasing me for the last week or so. I finally got hold of him yesterday, and we had a conversation. And what Patrick Vernon wants to do is for us to support him with the Windrush Vigil, part of the 75 years in Windrush Square in Brixton. And we've just agreed a date, which is the Thursday before Good Friday. We think we can get good media coverage on that day in the afternoon. So that is the proposal. There will be a planning meeting organized in the next few days into next week to get more interest, but he's come directly to us as part of the Justice for Windrush Generation campaigning work. And so the Windrush Allied Network should be aware of this, and whatever we can do to support this, let's try and do that. We've said this before, that the 75 years is not a time for celebration. And it's really the reason why we've chosen the vigil is to really look at what has happened to Windrush people over that period of time. And clearly, by far the majority of the first generation has died, and only a few remaining. Second generation and third generation are still here, but their experience and the access and the environment that we spoke about, the hostile environment, continues. So if we can support that, that would be great. It's just in the early stage of development. So in terms of the running order for the day, that's to be decided. A number of different organizations want to participate, including Black Equity Organization, which is the newly formed national organization to bring these Black issues to the fore. You may remember last year when they launched the Black Equity Organization, there was a big spread in the Guardian as to the membership of this organization. Really got good membership, good membership in the media, good membership across politics, good membership in business, really good membership. They have a dedicated website, and their aims are set out on that website in what they're trying to achieve over the next 5 years. And so they have clout, so it's the first time an organization of this size have got clout. So we will be supporting what they're trying to do over the next, not just for Windrush, but there are other things around social justice, other things around education, etc. There's a whole range of work ahead of us. So as soon as I get more information in relation to the village, lost my train of thought. The
Vigil.
vigil, which is I think it's the 6th.
Yeah,
I think it's the
6th.
6th, Thursday the 6th. That's the proposed date. Yeah, the day before Good Friday.
Eric, I'm going to make a suggestion. The speaker that we're going to have next week would prefer to do a different date. Would it be an idea next week if we take the session to focus again about Windrush and the preparations for Windrush 75, so that we're really up to speed when it comes? We're going to do a series of sessions, Montaz and Sean. I think you're the only ones perhaps don't know. We're going to do a series of sessions with the time the Windrush left the Caribbean that week. And then the next week we'll do something else about Windrush next week. So we're going to do like 5 weeks focused on. I know
that's a good idea. And we've said we've said
okay,
this.
let's wrap this up and we'll carry on chatting afterwards.
Good idea.
Oh, and thank you so much again, Montaz. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Garrick. Thank you, June. McCarthy, it's always brilliant when you're able to join us. Caroline, absolutely delighted that you've been able to join us, and we love your picture. Yes, Caroline's so she was able to join us at lunchtime. Thanks, Caroline.
Yes, okay.
Okay, thanks, Roland, and as ever, thanks, Simon. Okay, can you switch the recording off now, Simon?